Joining us today will be Angela Tin, with Vice President of Environmental Health and for the American Lung Association. She brings over 20 years of experience in studying, enforcing environmental and health regulations, and a solid reputation for telling it like it is. We also have on stage is Jessie Stolark. She's an associate with Environmental and Energy Study Institute in Washington, D.C. Jessie is working on renewable natural resources, working pertaining to sustainable biomass production and use in the United States, such as bio-based fuels, power, chemicals, and products. So with no further ado, I'll invite Jessie to the podium and we'll look at what she has to show us.
Thanks, Jerry. And before we get started, thanks for making it to the bitter end. I think a lot of what at least I have to say was echoed by previous presentations, so I'll try to keep it brief. So we have a lot of great questions that Iowa Renewable Fuels Association and Jerry came up with us to discuss together. But before I get started, just to give you a little bit of background information on my organization, as Jerry said, I'm with the Environmental and Energy Study Institute, and we actually came out of a bipartisan congressional caucus over 30 years ago, but today we function as an independent nonprofit. But our core function is really the same. We're trying to, if you haven't ever interacted with congressional staff, they're usually very smart, they're very young, and they have a lot of issues that they're responsible for. So we are trying to basically aid them in their decision-making process by providing fact-based, nonpartisan information to them, and we do that through a variety of means. We have white papers, we have congressional briefings, we have newsletters. And the one thing I really love about EESI is that everything is freely available to the public. So you can go on our website, you can check out our past briefings, you can watch live casts of our briefings. In the past couple of years, we've done a lot of work on E15, for example. There's a fact sheet we have on the RVP waiver and kind of what the environmental and health implications of that waiver would be for going to a higher blend. So without further ado, I'll get started here. So for EESI, and we've been supporters of biofuels and the bio-based economy really since the beginning. We've both been supportive of the RFS, as well as the Farm Bill, the energy title, and because we are really passionate about two problems, climate change and air pollution. And really, I don't see them as separate. So we can talk about it as climate, or we can talk about air pollution. They're really one and the same. And why are biofuels so important? I think, this is also great to be here with all of you because I don't have to win anybody over in the room. But transportation emissions are continuing to climb. We're making really good progress on getting emissions down in the power sector, and that's largely because of switching from coal to natural gas. It's also because prices of renewables are coming down. But if we look at our transportation sector, in 2016, transportation sector emissions eclipsed power sector emissions. And as we've heard today, the transportation sector is just very difficult to transition, to decarbonize, to move to new fuels. There's a lot of challenges there. And if we dig down a little deeper in the US, transportation emissions are predominantly, they're 27% of total US economy emissions, but most of those emissions are coming from the light duty fleet, the passenger cars and vehicles. I'm not going to belabor this point that we're going to use liquid fuels for decades. I think we've heard a lot about that today. And I agree with everyone who has said before me that it's not an either or proposition. I think biofuels can't be the enemy of electric vehicles. It's going to take all technologies. And certainly electric vehicles offer the greatest reductions as far as greenhouse gases and air pollutants. But at the same time, we're going to need even in the near term, we're going to need range extenders on electric vehicles. We're also going to be using liquid fuels in a lot of sectors for decades in our trucking, in our aviation, in marine. So I think there's a lot of potential for the biofuels industry to continue to grow as we look forward. And it takes a long time for the fleet to turn over, and we're not even talking about what the rest of the world is going to be doing in the next several decades. And actually, if you look at the numbers, the number of cars in the developing world is only projected to increase over the next few decades, and most of those cars will not be electric vehicles. So certainly there is a huge role for biofuels to play going forward. So today, they asked me to talk about greenhouse gases, and they asked me to talk about air pollution. I'm going to focus mostly on greenhouse gases. And so when we, compare ethanol to oil, how do we know that it is greener, that it is a better product? Well, there's this analysis that scientists do, wells to wheels analysis. It sounds really complicated. It's really a mass balance. It's looking at what are the inputs and what are the outputs. And we can do this for any type of fuel. And the people have done it with models, so sort of in different scenarios. But USDA actually did something really interesting for corn ethanol 2 years ago. They looked at what were the actual greenhouse gas reductions for corn ethanol retrospectively, not looking at what potentially could happen, but what actually happened. And then they found for 2014 corn ethanol conditions, sort of a midline conditions, that there was much greater than a 20% greenhouse gas reduction. And 20% is what's called for in a reduction in greenhouse gases, is what's called for in the RFS for first generation biofuels. They found that on average, actually, there's a 43% reduction in greenhouse gases. And then they did project out, and they said, over time, due to improvements in the industry and improvements in farming, it's going to become more efficient. There will be more co-products, less energy use, that greenhouse gas emissions profile is going to continue to drop. And then the final bar on this chart, which I think is kind of interesting, they said, okay, well, in 2022, if we adopt even more conservation practices on the farm that are going to put more carbon back in our soils, use less petrochemical inputs, what could we achieve? And it's even greater. So what's the flip side? Well, the flip side, the other choice we have is oil. And so when we look at, they've done the same thing for oil, and if you look at the Renewable Fuel Standard, the baseline is gasoline from 2005. But just like biofuels have changed since 2005 and the way we produce them, so has oil. So we have two kinds of oil that we use, conventional crude and unconventional crude. Conventional crude is easy to extract, it's less energy intensive to extract and refine, and it occurs in liquid form. And then we have unconventional crude, which is very energy intensive to extract and refine, and it's usually dirtier. And what we found is, well, you don't hear about peak oil really anymore, and that's because we've used most of, if not all of the conventional crude out there, but we're now starting to use the unconventional crude. And so scientists at Argonne National Laboratory kind of looked at this question a couple of years ago, and they actually found that oil coming from the Canadian tar sands had about 20% higher emissions than conventional crude oil. So if you don't remember anything else than what I've said today, is that ethanol and biofuels are getting cleaner, but oil is getting dirtier at the same time. And again, I think a lot of people have made this point, but I think this is your industry's, the biofuels industry's #1 selling point, is that ethanol is clean octane. When I talk to people who are maybe skeptical about biofuels, I say, well, we have this thing in our fuel supply, octane, and we need octane in our fuel, and we really only have two choices. We have ethanol, which is a renewable component, it's cleaner and it's cheaper, or we have oil, which is dirtier, and the portion of oil that we're using to provide octane is really dirty, and we can talk about that more in the questions. I think Angela's going to talk more about that. And we know, from previous talks, we know that the autos want additional octane. So I think this is our real selling point. And now the question is, how do you sell that to consumers? We heard earlier, I think John discussing, consumers don't understand what octane is. But I think, looking forward, looking regulatory and within the industry, all the players in the industry, this is the biggest selling point right now. And then just to touch briefly about air quality, we're talking a lot today about E15. Absolutely, going from E10 to E15, it's a modest increase, but it's going to still have a benefit. It's going to reduce ozone precursors. There really is no safe level of ozone. It's going to reduce greenhouse gases, and it's going to also reduce volatile organic compounds. All of these things that are coming out of the tailpipe that we want to reduce, E15 is going to be a modest but important step for us. So I had really three kind of takeaways from you, and I'll reiterate them, is that, in this discussion, especially when you're talking with outside folks, there are no perfect fuels, and I think, we're very upfront with that, but biofuels are getting cleaner and oil is getting dirtier. And electric vehicles are coming, and we are going to need them, but biofuels are going to continue to play a really important role in our transportation sector. And biofuels are the best liquid fuel we have available today to meet both environmental and health goals. So with that, I'll turn it over to Angela.
welcome Angela up to the podium.
Jessie.
She's with the American Lung Association, and she's got a very good presentation on air quality.
Hi, thank you. I think it can only get warmer, right? I think. Anyway, I call myself a recovered regulator. I used to be with the EPA for, I don't say the years anymore, but many, many years, and I've sat in court. I've written thousands of notice of violation letters. I have argued emission limits. I have written permits. And I find as the years go by, there's nobody out there to sue anymore because mainly everybody is coming into compliance. We're at the limit of technology and everybody is complying. But the pollution is still a problem, so what is the problem? And one thing I've realized in my career is that the problem is us. So here we are. So what causes air pollution? There's many different sources of air pollution. Industrial sources, which are getting less and less. They're controlling their emissions. Homes, our chimneys, our fireplaces. Outdoor burning, small sources, but there's lots of many multiple small sources. Fires, natural causes fires. This year, the emission limits and the violations in California will skyrocket. And they're going to say, well, it's a problem with this, but it's the fires. It's naturally occurring. We have a hot day in Chicago. We got an emission violation. Does not necessarily mean that industry caused it, but you got to keep in mind that the temperature causes the problem. So this is actual data that my staff used to collect, and we collected this every day, every state in the United States, and this is collected, not modeling data, actual data from industrial sources. They have monitors up their stack. The environmental protection agencies put out monitors all over the buildings, and they collected data. As the years went by, they started putting ground level monitors and collected ground level data. And if you take this data and you analyze it, and I did this for several of the Midwest states, and you divide it up by the fractions of sources of where the pollution comes from, no matter what city, what state you live in, very small city, very large city, the number one cause is mobile transportation sources. And that's a fact. There's no argument. 70, 80% is mobile transportation sources. So what are the health effects of ozone? We breathe it in. Our body is quite a miracle. It can trap things we're not supposed to breathe in. It takes coals. It takes care of all pollution, dust. We've got a lot of defenses in our systems. But when it gets overwhelmed and we breathe it into our lungs and we have effects of ozone, it travels from the lungs into the blood system and throughout the body. So there's many effects of ozone, respiratory effects. Particulate matter, most of the large things that you breathe in, the dust from the fields, the dust from construction, you can expel it, you can swallow it, harmfully remove it. But what happens is that the very small particles is what gets into your lungs. And from your lungs, it travels into your bloodstream. And from your bloodstream, it goes into your heart and other body organs and causes DNA mutation. It's not what you can see that harms you, it's what you can't see. So when you go out there and you look and say, oh, the sky's so blue, it's so pretty, that's not necessarily, your worries aren't gone because you could still have a problem because of the fine particulate. It's not what you can see, it's what you can't see. And another thing that I've come to learn in my career is that, I do a lot of environmental work and we talk about air quality and how important air quality is, but if you don't link it to human health, it doesn't serve a purpose. You have to link it to human health. And we each know people in our lives that have been affected, that have respiratory problems, young people, older people, children, healthy people. Toxic components. Now, when EPA goes out and regulates, I always get the question, well, why aren't they regulating CO2? Why aren't they regulating the toxics? Well, what EPA does is they go out and they say, this is what they're going to regulate. And they started with the conventional pollutants. And they said, these are the conventional pollutants, NOx, SOx, PM, ozone. And once we get a handle on these conventional pollutants, we're going to go into CO2. And then we're going to go into the toxics. Well, many, many years have gone by and they can't even get a handle on the conventional pollutants yet. In the other medias of water pollution, land pollution, they have got a handle on it, and they're dealing with hazardous materials, hazardous substances, toxics, and they're beyond conventional. But in the air pollution, which is one of the oldest medias out there, they haven't got a handle on pollution. CO2. CO2, where does it come from? It comes from the use of fossil fuels. There's no other source. Use of fossil fuels and the manufacture of cement. Well, we're not going to stop building roads and buildings, so we've got to do something, and the only thing that we've got to give is the use of the fossil fuels. And there's other environmental effects. You think it just affects the bodies, the humans. It also has a damage on the rubber of the cars. It affects the fields, the farm fields. It causes pollution on the buildings. It causes corrosion on the concrete. So there's a lot of other environmental effects from air pollution, just other than outside the body. And we sometimes forget about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. I noticed in Jessie's comment, she talked about carbon sequestration and being a farmer and seeing how our farming operation has changed considerably. We've become more and more sustainable, and we've got 36 to 38,000 corn plants out there per acre, producing over 600 gallons of ethanol per acre. You know, what better CO2 carbon sink can we have other than an Iowa or Midwest cornfield out there producing ethanol? And if you could comment further on that, or what's your views on what we can do in agriculture to help with this?
Sure, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm right now about climate change and dealing with climate change, and I think certainly we can blame agriculture for problems, but I think we should be solutions oriented, and I think there are a lot of solutions that we can already point to that are already being implemented in the ag sector, and then there's also tools, whether it's through voluntary conservation programs in the Farm Bill or other mechanisms to incentivize that behavior. And then I also think there's research going on right now looking at kind of what is the carbon sequestration when you're growing corn for ethanol, and trying to incorporate that further into understanding whether, I know on a lot of fronts, whether that information will be taken up by EPA is another question, but I still think, looking at even at other state level policies, they're kind of looking at California and even other states that are looking at low carbon fuels, continuously incorporating that information into their models and to their carbon intensity scores for their fuels.
They also have to look at the CO2 production that comes from, for example, from natural gas. When they do fracking, they bring up a lot of CO2, and what they try to do is bury it deep into the aquifer, and it always comes up. So you can't just look at ethanol or gas, you've got to look at all the different fossil fuels.
There was some discussion earlier about different vehicles, and I'd ask each of you to describe what you feel would be the perfect level fuel for today's engines that would provide the best performance and yet minimize our health risk for our consumers.
The perfect vehicle, and there's some young people there, the perfect vehicle for people is the vehicle that you choose. I can't tell you the perfect vehicle because you have an idea of what you would like to drive, whether it be an SUV, a sports car, a van. What is the perfect vehicle? But what you have to do is when you buy that vehicle, you have to consider the fuel that you're going to be using and trying to come up with the fuel that you can buy today that you can use that will help improve the environment.
I'm a really strong believer in the research that's been done on looking at a mid-level blend, whether that's an E25 or an E30, where you're simply adding the ethanol to the base fuel, so you're increasing the ethanol, you're displacing the toxic components in the gasoline, so you're getting a much cleaner fuel, and then you can pair that with a very highly efficient engine, and so you're both getting fuel efficiency from the engine, and then you're also getting it in the fuels, and that we need to start looking at our fuels and our engines as a system. Really, all of our efficiency improvements have come from the engine, and we haven't really, beyond E10, haven't really made a big change to our fuel system yet.
Okay, seeing as how Monty didn't script my questions, I will ask you one. Our neighbors to the north in Minnesota, when you go up there now and buy diesel, it's 20% biodiesel. Iowa being the largest ethanol producer, if we put E15 in to replace E10 as our normal fuel, would that 5% increase in ethanol make a considerable difference in our air that we breathe? Going from E10 to E15, would that clean up our air considerably?
I think it would, because any change, any increase would make a difference. And the petroleum companies are fighting it so hard. I mean, there must be a reason why they're fighting that 5% increase. Yes, any displacement of the gasoline would make a difference. We're not going to change our driving patterns. We're not going to change the miles we drive, so we have to change the fuel.
So, with E15, we're providing a cleaner fuel, we're providing more power, and we're having a lower cost to our consumers. To me, it'd be a no-brainer, but for what I think and what we could get through the Iowa legislature might be a different story. But I think it's something that the state of Iowa should look at. If Minnesota can move to B20, Iowa should be able to move to E15. Got another question here with gasoline contains more than 200 different compounds, several which have been proven to be a cancer risk. Which of these toxic compounds could be eliminated by changing the fuel mixture to include a higher percentage of ethanol?
So I think you're referring to what we call the gasoline aromatics, and we can't remove them totally, but we can drastically reduce them by going to a higher blend. And I was just looking at some work the other day, and it noted that from even going to E0 to E10 was a 25% reduction in aromatic content for gasoline. So, that's huge. And so if we could go higher than that, absolutely, we could really displace some of those compounds.
And when a compound is designated carcinogenic, and EPA designates benzene, toluene, and a few others as Class A carcinogens, that means that there is data, proof, and evidence that it is a carcinogen to humans, not to lab rats and not modeling studies. There is data that shows that it is a carcinogen, and they don't designate that very easily.
The Renewable Fuel Standard is attempting to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions with biofuels. How much progress has been made through the RFS in actually cutting the greenhouse gases from the air? So probably go back to 2005 to present.
I tried to look at specific, I don't have specific numbers from you, but I know it's a great deal. And I think, if you looking at those numbers from USDA, they're over double what's actually called for in the statute. And I think one reason why there's confusion over that point is that when the EPA is calling for a 20% reduction, and so even if a facility is going over that 20%, in EPA's mind, they're meeting the letter of the law, and so they don't have to go back and document that, even though in a lot of cases we do have that information. So yeah, it's been a tremendous benefit.
Yes, and I actually have the monitoring data from city by city, and we can track it down 20 years. We can see the improvement in air quality just with the changes in the unleaded gasoline and then the 10% ethanol.
So the progress has been documentable.
It has been documentable. But remember, an EPA or nonprofits or environmental group, we're always looking for improvements. And so it's hard to say, well, it's great because we're always looking for improvements, so you can't say really both, but it is definitely documentable.
What's the one thing you want our audience to consider before reaching for the fuel nozzle the next time they fill up with their vehicle? Being on the IRFA board, they keep saying, well, we don't want to confuse our consumer. We don't want to confuse our consumer. Most of the pumps have 4 selections on them, but yet if you go into the convenience store, you got 4,000 different selections of beverages you can pick up, or 500 different candy bars, whatever. Admittedly, it'd be nice if everybody was more uniform in the hose color they used, et cetera, but I guess what would you want the audience to consider most? Would it be price or what we're doing for our health and the performance of the vehicles?
You know, I think you're really lucky here in the Midwest, as some people alluded to. The availability at the pump is not, it's much more limited in other areas of the country. So I think first and foremost, you should be using your product. You know, do your homework, check your owner's manual. A lot of newer vehicles are explicitly approving E30. And I know that a lot of people are saying that the data even supports using it in vehicles that the manufacturer does not explicitly approve it, but I'm going to be cautious and say check your owner's manual. And then E15 is the most tested fuel that's out there, and it's safe to use, and so that you should, you know, go ahead and use that product, and that's, you know, because you are lucky to have that choice here.
It's kind of like recycling. Recycling is not cheap. Recycling takes a lot of work. You've got to study what happens to your waste as you recycle it. And it's not, you know, it takes extra effort. And so it's a clean air choice, which is similar to recycling. It's the right thing to do.
I'd also like to ask anyone from the audience to please go to the microphone if you have questions for Angela or Jessie. Do you foresee the health risks of exposure to the toxic emissions from gasoline becoming so severe that Congress will have to make amendments to the Clean Air Act or change the law? Or do you think that the rest of the people in the fuel industry are going to realize the efforts that you have been putting forth and try to clean up their own act?
I think you've got to solve the problem with ozone and PM first before the Clean Air Act is changed to look into toxics or other components. I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us. We have a complex problem, but there's a very simple solution, and they've got to look for that.
And I would like to believe ethanol is part of that solution.
Yes, yes. Today, that's available today.
Okay. Do we have a question from the
Sure.
audience?
My name is John Norwood. Thank you for the discussion. I like the thinking about closed loop systems. And it's interesting to me, we're selling ethanol as a benefit in part because of the low carbon footprint. But I think we also need to consider that 40% of the corn produced in Iowa, as an example, finds its way then into the feed industry. We grow 50 million hogs here a year. And through the manure that those hogs produce, we are producing a very large quantity of methane. That methane goes up into the atmosphere, and as you know, it's 20 times more potent than CO2. So I'm wondering if we really want to think about how do we drive the impact of ethanol, we ought to try to figure out how we take that methane and capture it. And we may have to, just like other industries, oil and gas, capping CO2 coming out of, or methane coming out of wells, scrubbers in the electric industry on CO2 sources. We really need to pay more attention, I would argue, on that methane and figure out how, if we have to have a subsidy or some system to capture that stream of greenhouse gas warming. It's an annuity stream. It's going to happen as long as we have people on the earth. We produce a third of the nation's pork in this state. I would be interested in your comments.
Yeah, I'm so glad you raised that question about manure. I love to talk about manure. It's kind of strange. But I think absolutely there is a huge solution in front of us, and it's biogas. And through anaerobic digestion, we can convert manures into useful products like biogas. And there's actually, I don't think, maybe it was alluded to in earlier presentations, there is a pathway under the RFS, or a pending pathway in front of the EPA that would allow electricity that's produced from biogas, which would primarily come from the agricultural sector, but also comes from landfills and other sources, to produce what they were calling an E-RIN, or an electric RIN, and so that they can use that to produce power, and then that power can be counted, you know, if you can, as long as you can prove that it's going into electric vehicles, and they have a complex accounting system to show this, that they can generate RINs through that. And so there's a lot of interest in using that, and there's a lot of interest right now in biogas because states are, like for instance, California has an organics recycling mandate. And I think additionally with water quality being a huge concern and that concentrated manure, we have to deal with it. We have to do something with it. And so the answer is biogas. And whether that's through the RFS or state mandates or other mechanisms, I think it's starting to happen.
Have time for one more question?
Okay. Thank you. Steve Vandegreen, Urban Air Initiative. And I think both of you have a unique perspective that would be helpful here, in that a lot of the environmental groups, people in Capitol Hill, do not view ethanol as being a cleaner fuel. And I know we've talked a little bit about, the real world fuels and the real world emission benefits. What would be your recommendation to, change the attitude here from the ethanol industry, that ethanol, the 1 pound waiver, we're not raising toxics, we're actually lowering it, or we're reducing, depending how you model it, 8 to 10 billion gallons of aromatics annually out of the gasoline. I think those things have to be relayed to the environmental groups, that we are making some substantial benefits here. What would be your recommendation to the ethanol industry to get that message better relayed to those people that currently today would probably oppose the increasing levels of ethanol?
Steve, I think that's a very slow process. The American Lung Association is the oldest voluntary health organization since 1904. And 14 years ago, we didn't do any work with ethanol. We didn't do any work with energy. And we've been here doing it 14 years, and there hasn't been any other groups that have come up to support any of our movements or our talks. And in fact, a lot of them really don't agree with a lot of the things that we are saying. So it's been a long, hard road, Steve. I hope it's easier in the future, but it's difficult. Because a lot of these groups are looking for the perfect solution in tomorrow's time. And what we're hoping for is we've got all the patients that are sick today, and we want to take care of people today.
I think two things on Steve's question is the first is really to focus on health. I think that's the winning argument for ethanol. We can argue, because I do it with people back in DC all the time, argue about the environmental impacts, and there's always a but, and so I think you can win the environmental argument, and I think there's a very strong environmental argument, but at the same time, I think the health argument is much more straightforward. It's much easier for people to understand, and this is people's health, and these are people's lives. The World Health Organization says, I think, that 9 out of 10 people are breathing dirty air in the world. So it's certainly of huge concern. And then how to push that issue forward is, I think, through supporting the good work, whether it's through Urban Air Initiative or other groups that are trying to look at the research that's coming out about the effects of ethanol blended fuel and what is the impact on air quality, because there is a lot of confusion in the literature. And Steve's group actually just supported a study that reviewed 100 peer-reviewed studies on air quality and ethanol, and they could find no consensus. And it's because of what Adam Gustafson was referencing earlier, this question of how are the fuels blended in the studies, and they're looking at very certain parameters. But the bottom line is that real-world fuels, or fuels that reflect real-world conditions, need to be used in these studies. And so I think that's where the industry can help play a role, is continuing to support or push out that research. I find that at least in Washington and environmentalists, over time, if you can build up the data, the body of evidence, that's really your best case or your best chance in bringing people over to your side.
One of the things I caught today, I believe it was Adam or Paul, that there's no longer going to be an incentive for the auto manufacturers to produce the flex fuel vehicles. And boy, I just feel like that's a tremendous step backwards, and we need to try to get that re-implemented for everybody, and hopefully they'll go back to doing that. But I guess we'd like to thank both Angela and Jessie for coming to Iowa here in January and for the information. And maybe you have a minute or two for a closing comment, or do you want to go?
I'm good.
With that, thank everybody in the audience for staying with us. So of course, we saved the best for last, and take the health concerns home and spread the word that would use all the ethanol to help clean up the environment. Thank you.